In today's watercolor tutorial, we're painting a vibrant pumpkin together. This is a fun, season-inspired little exercise that you can work on to continue developing your skills with foundational watercolor techniques such as wet on wet, wet on dry, layering for depth, and of course, color mixing. I'm explaining my entire process step by step, starting with my preliminary pencil sketch and moving on to layering watercolor for depth and detail. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Erika, and on here I share videos on sketching, watercolor, artist mindset, and from time to time, I also share videos on starting and growing an art business. If any of that sounds interesting to you, join this friendly art community by clicking subscribe. It's completely free, it means a lot to me, and it does a lot to help ensure that I can keep sharing these videos on here. If you'd like my downloadable outline drawing for this pumpkin so that you can skip over the freehand sketching portion, go ahead and click on the Patreon link that I'm going to be leaving in the description box right below this video. This post is free and open to the public, and if you scroll down to the bottom of the post, you're going to find the downloadable attachments that I have made available for you to go along with this tutorial. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. First things first, and I'm going to be creating my preliminary pencil sketch. I am using an HB pencil, and I am trying to keep my drawing nice and light so that I can easily erase mistakes, and also so that I can't see my pencil work through my paint at the end. For my block-in process, I always make my way large to small, general towards specific, and as you can see, instead of trying to create a perfect pumpkin shape right off the bat, what I do is I bring together a series of straight lines to help me visualize the overall general shape of the pumpkin and to help me understand how large the pumpkin is going to be within my picture plane here, as well as its location within space. I really want to utilize my drawing or painting space as best as I can and have this subject be where I want it to be, which is relatively centered within my watercolor sheet. Once that general blocky shape is in and it looks good to me, I start breaking it up into medium-sized and smaller shapes, starting in this case with those curved sections that are separated by those grooves, which I think in pumpkin anatomy are actually called ribs. And oftentimes when I am sketching fruit or vegetables, I like starting with the stem because the stem is always going to be a type of central axis, if you will, that is coming right out of the central upper part of the structure. And by situating that in place and having that in, it is easier to then draw all of these curved lines, which would actually be contour lines, and I can visualize those lines going all the way down and into the bottom center of the fruit or vegetable. So it helps me understand the structure more as being three-dimensional. And as I am drawing all of these medium-sized shapes, I make sure to bring in some level of asymmetry, imperfection, and irregularity, because this is an organic object after all, and if things look too perfect, it's just not going to look very natural at the end. Once everything is looking good to me, I go ahead and erase out my initial blocky shape that I started with. I refine my drawing a little bit more. Feel free to use your kneadable eraser to tap over your graphite work to make it a little bit lighter. And you're also going to see how I add in a cast shadow shape right under the pumpkin. And I also start visualizing where I want my highlights to be so that I can keep them protected throughout the painting process. Because those highlights are areas where I want to keep that bright paper shining through, as it is the paper that is going to stand in place for those lightest lights. And I usually sketch in highlight shapes that are larger than how I want my highlights to be at the end, but I would rather make them larger and protect a larger area in the beginning and make those shapes smaller as I go, because I know it's always going to be easier to darken than it is to lighten. I drew and painted this pumpkin from imagination, so before adding in those highlight shapes and the cast shadow under the pumpkin, I decided that the light source would be hitting the pumpkin from high above it, but not directly centered above the pumpkin. The light source is maybe a little bit farther back. And this is why the cast shadow shape is opposite to the light source on our side. The very first thing that I do is I prepare my color mixtures that I'm going to be needing for this first layer. On one side of my palette, I'm going to have my oranges and my red oranges, and on the other side, I'm going to be creating my dark greens and browns. We're only using 3 different colors throughout this painting process, but we are shifting and changing the ratios of our colors in our mixtures as we go, and continue developing that range of values that is going to help create that sensation of 3D-ness and depth. At the top, I have a mixture of New Gamboge and a teeny tiny bit of Pyrrole Scarlet. It is mostly New Gamboge, which is a warm yellow, and it is already orange looking. With watercolor, you want to make sure that you're not going in too dark too fast. In this initial layer, we're going to be developing the lightest values, and we're going to be getting darker and darker as we move on. The darker the value we're trying to create, the more red we bring into our mixture to darken it. You can even keep things really simple and initially just go in with your New Gamboge or whatever warm yellow it is that you're going to be using, and then bring in a bit more red and a bit more red into your mixture as you go. And in the other section of my mixing area, I have mixed together Undersea Green with Pyrrole Scarlet. Green and red are opposites in the color wheel. They are complementary colors. And when you mix enough of 2 complementary colors together, you're going to get a brown or a gray, depending on the specific colors that you're using. I thought this would be a great color for my vignette style background and also to paint in the cast shadow under the pumpkin. And simultaneously, if I needed to darken my green for the darkest greens in the stem, I can also add in a tiny bit of Pyrrole Scarlet into the green, and that will work for darker green areas. In the first layer, I also add in a little bit of plain undersea green here and there while the oranges are still wet, in order to have some hue variation throughout the pumpkin, some greenish looking areas. So do have some of your green ready. With my sketch done and my initial mixes ready to go, it was time to get started with layer number 1. And the first layer, we're going to be approaching wet into wet. This technique is not only going to help us keep our paper wet for a longer time so that we don't feel like we have to rush through this process, but that water that we place on our paper is also going to help us create these soft, diffused effects, which are excellent for this initial layer. So what I'm doing here is I'm using my size 14 round brush and taking a little bit of water at a time from my container, gently smoothing that water on all throughout the pumpkin, including the stem and the highlight shapes, until I arrive at that nice even sheen. Do not start painting in your color until your paper has been effectively pre-wetted. Otherwise, things are going to start to dry pretty quickly, and you're likely going to arrive at texture and splotchiness. I'm using cold pressed watercolor paper. It's 100% cotton and it's mid-weight. It is 140 pounds or 300 GSM in thickness or in weight. And I have not taped down my paper or have done any stretching beforehand. You can see how there is no buckling that can interfere with my painting process. All right, jumping right in, I am using my size 14 round brush, and you can see me add in even more of my New Gamboge into my mixture to make sure that I'm going in with almost plain New Gamboge in the beginning, and I'm gradually increasing the amount of red in my mixture. I would say this is kind of a coffee consistency, almost 50% water, 50% paint. You definitely don't want to go in with super watery paint, especially if your paper already has some water on it. It's already been pre-wetted. If you do, your color is going to appear very, very pale, and remember that watercolor dries even lighter than how it looks when it's wet. I always start by placing my color in the shadow areas because this gives me more control, as the paint is going to expand when you place it on paper that is wet. And if you start by placing your paint in those shadow areas, It gently expands into those lighter areas, creating these soft transitions where the darker, more saturated color turns softly into the white paper that you're trying to leave protected in those highlight areas. I place my color at the bottom of the structure, and I also place some in the grooves and where the stem is coming out, which is a space that is a little bit more concave. Once that initial layer is in, I add a little bit more red into the mixture and once again start by placing that in the shadow areas. As a rule of thumb, the darker I get with my color mixture, the less I paint in, because I don't want to cover up my initial lightest layer with this red orange that I am now using. If you do that, you're going to get rid of your lightest values and you're going to flatten things out and make everything look very heavy. So make sure that as you get darker and darker, you're a little bit more intentional about where you're placing those darker colors. Make sure you're only darkening those areas that really need to be darkened. Our objective here is to continue developing that range of values from lightest lights, darker midtones, and then darkest darks. And we're going to be doing this in a series of layers, so there's no need to go too dark too fast. So at this point, I think I have developed a good range of lighter values for this initial layer. I do go in with a clean and only slightly damp brush at the end to soften any transitions or get rid of any textures that I might have. I do my best to avoid over blending because that can lead to an overworked result. And I'm now going to pop in a little bit of green here and there just randomly so that I can have a natural variation in color throughout the pumpkin. So I bring in a little bit of undersea green into this section of my palette, which I probably should have placed in the bottom section, and I pop it in here and there. By this point, everything is still wet and workable because I took my time with the pre-wetting process. I also paint in an initial light green layer in the stem that I'm going to be building my values on. Even in the stem, I try to keep little teeny tiny highlights or sections of paper unpainted. And with that, I'm all done with layer number 1. You can see how I was able to save those highlights. It is time to allow this to dry completely, and then we're going to be moving on to layer number 2, where we're going to be darkening shadow areas wet on dry. All right, we have 2 more layers to work on to continue developing that realism and depth in this pumpkin. I've switched to a smaller brush. This is my size 8 round brush, and we're going back to that red-orange color mixture. Try to get it similar to the last mix that you were using in layer number 1. And we're going to be using this same color mixture, now wet on dry, to paint in the shadow shapes, in those grooves and also the planes that are facing away from the light. We are now painting on dry paper, which is going to make this color look darker because it's not softly dissipating out, it's staying constricted in that shape that you're painting in. Of course, if you want to make it look even darker, add a little bit more of your red into the mix and then pop it into those very darkest dark areas. But you can see how I'm painting these shadow shapes with intention. I'm being careful not to overly cover up too much of layer number 1 because I would be getting rid of those lightest values, which I very much need. As you continue painting in these shadow shapes, number 1, acknowledge them as abstract, irregular shapes. Don't paint in very solid looking shapes or lines because that is going to take away from the realism. And number 2, always observe the color and the value that you've already developed in that area before painting in your shadow shape, because you always want to take it gradually, incrementally toward your darker values. If you paint in a very dark red shape in a very light area, that is going to create a lot of contrast and is going to look very stark. So for me, it's always safer to go back to that color that I was last using in the previous layer. Try painting that in to see how it looks now that you're layering on more color, especially wet on dry. And then if you need to go a little bit darker, add in a tiny bit more red. After painting in my shadow shapes, I remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water by blotting my bristles on my absorbent towel, and I go in to soften edges. I don't soften every single edge, but just here and there to add a little bit of softness. And I try to do that while the paint is still wet. I'm being very careful not to cover up too much of that initial layer, especially in planes that are facing toward the light. And I'm also doing my best to keep those highlights protected. Though by this point, you can see how my highlight shapes are already starting to become smaller. I'm starting to use more linear brush strokes or even a little bit of dry brushing here and there to help me start describing some of the texture in this pumpkin skin. Right around here, you're gonna see me go in to make some of these highlight shapes at the top a little bit smaller. I do make sure to go in with my plain new gamboge as I am going into those areas because those are lighter value areas. After painting in those light shapes, I go in with a slightly damp brush and just soften some edges here and there. And now I'm going in to do my second layer in the stem. And I did switch on over to my size 3 round brush because this is a smaller area. And I do want to create finer brush strokes to help me convey that texture in the stem. So going in with my undersea green, you can see how I'm using those more linear but curved brush strokes, leaving slivers of that initial layer shining through. That is going to help you describe the texture in the stem. And you can see how the upper part of that cylindrical structure is left with little to no paint in it because it is facing toward the light. I'm always thinking of the three-dimensional structure of what it is that I'm painting and shading in, and remembering the location of the light source. And then I switched on back to my size 14 round brush and I mixed together undersea green and pyrrole scarlet to create this vibrant kind of chocolatey brown that would work really well for my background. I really like repeating colors in my pieces, and I oftentimes use colors that I've used inside the subject in the background because I know that this will lead to more cohesive, well-integrated results. To paint my vignette background, I made sure to load up my paintbrush well in order to paint as much as possible before having to reload my brush. I need to paint fast because I'm painting wet on dry, and if I take too long or need to create more of my paint color, I can run the risk of my edges of the previous shape starting to dry and just creating too much texture. And another thing that helps me paint faster is pressing down the belly of my brush and wiggling as I'm making my way out. This wiggling motion is also going to help you create very cool dry brushing effects and an irregular look to that edge of the vignette. Once I was done painting that background shape, I switched back to my size 6 round brush and I'm just doing a little bit of cleanup work along those edges. And then it was time to allow everything to dry. After everything had dried, I did a little bit more cleanup work along those edges, especially in a spot where some of that brown went into the pumpkin. So I'm doing some gentle scrubbing with a clean and only slightly damp size 3 round brush in that edge, and then blotting with my clean absorbent towel, lifting up some of that color. All right, and then it was time to move on to layer number 3. We're continuing to push that contrast. I now am using my size 6 round brush because I'm painting smaller shapes the darker I get. And by this point, my red-orange color mixture has a lot more of my pyrrole scarlet in it, but I am making sure that I'm not painting in shapes that are super red. I don't want my pumpkin to start looking red. Continue testing out your color mixtures as you go. I'm being extra mindful to just paint in this color in the darkest dark areas. Because we're continuing to do our layering wet on dry, you're going to be left with sharp defined edges around these shapes again. So whenever you want to go in and soften edges, just remove that paint from your paintbrush bristles and run your clean and slightly damp brush over those edges that you're looking to soften, but don't feel the need to soften everything out. It's nice to end up with a combination of soft transitions and some sharp edges here and there. By this point in the painting process, I'm also starting to incorporate more brush strokes that help me describe more of the texture in this pumpkin's skin. So sometimes it's more linear brush strokes like the ones that I used in the stem. Other times it's more of a scrubbing or almost dry brushing effect. Sometimes with little to no paint in my bristles. So I'm continuing to expand that range of values, getting into the darkest darks now, while simultaneously starting to incorporate more textures. I always bring to mind that principle that texture follows form. So I always prioritize creating believable depth and structure in the general before thinking of texture and smaller plane changes. Here I notice that I need some lighter values in the sections at the top, so I make sure to go in with more New Gamboge in my mixture. Once I'm done there, I push some contrast in the stem using my undersea green. And for my stem, I do go back to my size 3 round brush and I'm using more linear upward strokes to help me describe the texture in the stem. Undersea green from Daniel Smith is already on its own a pretty dark, deep, rich green. So I'm able to develop a nice range of green values just with that single green. However, if you're using a lighter green, you could always add a little bit of your red into your green to create a darker version of it. And finally, I go in to paint my cast shadow shape under the pumpkin. And for that, I use my size 14 round brush and I go back to my brown color mixture that I was using for my vignette. For my cast shadow, I can go in with a brown color mixture that is a little bit thicker than the consistency that I was initially using for the vignette. I'm going to finish up with a light yellow glaze, and you might not have to do this. I would not recommend doing any more layering unless you absolutely have to, because the more layers you create, the easier it is to arrive at overworked results. Sometimes I like finishing my paintings with a glaze, which is a translucent watered down layer that you create over your previous layers. It can help do a few things. For example, it can help make highlight areas a little bit smaller if you feel you could use that. It can also help brighten the entire piece. It can help soften transitions between your values and just bring everything together. In this case, I feel I could use a bit of a glaze, especially in the upper planes, to make my highlights a little bit smaller and brighten the piece a little bit more. So I use my size 14 round brush and I go in with my very first color. This is plain New Gamboge. Make sure to use it in a watered down consistency, and I'm very loosely just painting in some of this color in those upper plane sections. I also go in to do a little bit of splattering while everything is still partially damp. For this, I go back to my size 8 round brush. I make a little bit more of my last color mixture, which has plenty of that pyrrole scarlet in it. Do a little bit of splattering by flicking the bristles of my brush with my index finger of my non-dominant hand. And I also create a mix of pyrrole scarlet, New Gamboge, and a little bit of undersea green and do some splattering with that mixture. And at the very end, I decide to go in to push the contrast, especially in those grooves, a tiny bit more. I'm using my size 3 round brush and that darker, more muted orangish color that I created by mixing together the undersea green, Pyrrole Scarlet and New Gamboge, and I'm just painting in a little bit of this color here and there in some of these grooves. Really trying to stay away from the look of lines because that is not going to lead to natural results. My paper is still a little bit damp, so I'm arriving at relatively soft effects around those edges. Doing a little bit more work in this section at the back. I feel it's looking a little bit flat. Because that area is lighter, I need to make sure to go back to my initial color mixture that has more of the New Gamboge in it, less of the red. Once that lighter mid-tone has been created, I can add a little bit more red into the mixture and darken areas gradually there. I really hope that you enjoyed this fall-inspired watercolor tutorial, and thank you so very much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, enjoy your art practice, and see you very, very soon.